welcome everybody. I can see we've got already over 50 participants. And so let's go ahead and get it started so that we can make the most of our time here. Welcome to the latest session on the latest and greatest empirical methods. Today we're going to be talking about question-driven research. My name is Starr, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Maryland. And today I'm just delighted to moderate a panel of just superb scholars who are going to talk about this topic. To motivate it briefly, the dominant approach to empirical research and strategy, at least in published manuscripts, is a hypothesis-driven approach, whereby hypotheses based on logical arguments are drawn from existing theories or new theories and then are subsequently tested. But a recent call in SMJ recognizes that the hypothesis-driven approach has several limitations that may constrain the strategy field's ability to undertake important empirical research. And so this call emphasizes a question-driven or phenomenon-driven approach, which are common in other fields such as economics, finance, and the natural sciences. But question-driven research can take many forms, and it may be unfamiliar to many in the strategy community. And so today, what we've done is gathered some of the leading lights of our field to help us better understand what question-driven research is and how to do it. And so let me introduce our panelists briefly. We have Will Mitchell here, who is the Anthony S. Fell Chair in New Technologies and Commercialization at the University of Toronto. Will was a co-editor at SMJ from 2007 to 2015, and one of the editors of the SMJ special issue on question-driven research. Tim Simko is an associate professor of strategy and innovation at the Questrom School of Business. He serves as an associate editor at Management Science and the Journal of Industrial Economics. Giada De Stefano is an associate professor at Bocconi University and is on the editorial boards of several leading journals. And Rashi Agarwal is the Rudolph Lamone Chair in Entrepreneurship and Strategy at the University of Maryland. She's also the current co-editor-in-chief of SMJ. So thank you to all of our excellent panelists for being here and for taking the time to share your thoughts with us today. Each presenter has prepared approximately 10 minutes worth of remarks. If you are a participant, please raise questions and additional thoughts in the chat, and hopefully we'll have time in between discussions here or at the end of the panel to address these questions. And so to kick things off, I'm going to hand the floor over to Will, who is going to take it away.
Hey, thanks, Tim, and thanks to you all. As Tim said, 10 minutes max. I just turned my timer on. I'm at 9:55. If it buzzes, I'll stop. So we did one of my former doctoral students, Olia Solomon, I asked her to do a look at SMJ publications over about a 10-year period and count up the number that had hypotheses in them. And I think, if I remember correctly, it was 80%, somewhere between 80 and 85%. And then we did a random sample or an arbitrary sample and went and looked at some of the papers and asked the question, do we really believe the logic that leads up to the hypotheses? Is there really tight logic that gets the hypotheses? And the short answer was, in the vast majority of those, the short answer was no. There was loose logic, but I at least, and the people, my colleagues who were looking at it could easily have come up with different hypotheses. And I'm not claiming that people came up with hypotheses after the results or anything like that. It's just that we're so conditioned to thinking that we have to have a hypothesis that that's the way we structured the paper, and we didn't push ourselves hard enough to come up with strong logic. And we can think of other journals, I don't need to name them, that have promoted that format. So we thought, what are the solutions to that? One possible solution is only to do papers, only publish papers where you can have really, really tight logic underlying a hypothesis. And that would leave, if we could go that route, it would mean that we'd end up ignoring a whole bunch of important research. Because I think for me, one of the absolute center points of the strategy field, and especially in the context of the SMS, is that we've been willing to take on complex, multi-causal, ambiguous questions, or clear questions, but that have ambiguous logic. And I don't want to give that up bluntly. I think it's actually a center point of our field, that we don't force ourselves to only do research that has clear structure in the questions, or at least in the logic underlying the questions. So what are the approaches? And the goal here is to get robust results, well framed. And both of those parts are really important, right? There has to be a clear framing for what we're trying to accomplish. And then there have to be results that somebody will believe, the people we care about will believe. And, that may be theoretical concepts, where there's ambiguity in how they fit together, and we use questions around the theoretical concepts. It may be empirical holes, where there's just a bunch of really interesting, important things out there in the empirical setting, and we just don't understand how they all fit together, so we frame them in terms of the empirical holes. But whether it's a theoretical hole or an empirical hole, there needs to be a clear audience. And so part of the framing is to make sure that we know who it is that we're talking to. And, you know, some of you at least have heard me talk about red state versus blue state research, and some of you may have used heard me proclaim about the 4-sentence first paragraph. I won't spend the time on that. But those models this is essentially red state research. It's not necessarily atheoretic, because red state's not atheoretic, but it's caring about the empirical whole, or caring about the whole. And you need to have the clarity of audience, the clarity of question, the clarity of conventional wisdom, and the clear understanding of where the whole is, and then a clear contribution to the whole. Now, as Tim said, there's multiple modes, and here there's a tension, right? Because as much as I can decry the weakness of the hypothesis-driven approach, or the dominance of the hypothesis-driven approach, it does have a value, which is it gives us a model and a template, and something that we can sort of have a shared language and a shared understanding about. But that's also the risk, right? Because if we have templates, by definition, pare away things. They don't allow you to look at other things. And so we either don't look at other things, or we kind of stuff stuff into the template and it fits badly. So the tension is, on the one hand, is to have some models so that we have a shared understanding, a shared language, a shared way of evaluating our ideas, and being open to new ideas, new theories, new holes in theories, new empirics, new methods, to be able to drive our understanding rather than just fill in things within an existing paradigm. And so different models. Some of them are phenomenon driven, some of them are theory driven. You can have question based around theory, you can have question based around phenomena. You can have horse races. You know, there is a model of a horse race between, you know, there's theory 1, there's theory 2. Let's structure them really well, and let's run the race and figure out which one works. And do it honestly rather than hobble one of the horses from the beginning. A lot of the horse race papers I read really believe in one horse and have driven nails into the feet of one of the other horses, so that only one's going to win. Do it honestly, but certainly there are reasons to have. You can imagine a horse race. You can have multi-theories, you know, where you're fitting together ideas from multiple theories. They don't fit together perfectly logically, but you can see at least enough of a framing to be able to get started. It can be single theory with ambiguity. You know, there's resource-based theory of the firm. There's lots of ambiguity within it. Sometimes you can use it to come up with clear hypotheses. Sometimes it's framing, but it gives us a useful start. Some cases you can get to a framing proposition. It may not get all the way to a hypothesis, but it can be a general statement of there's enough theory here to make a general statement around what we tend to think is how we think things will work with a cause and an effect in it, even if we're not going to necessarily test it with a cause and effect result, but the theory can be, and statements can be causal, and then work from there. It can be in a purely empirical hole. It can be completely atheoretic, but with an audience that cares about it and strongly enough framed that it's done in a way that the audience will be able to grasp it, and evaluate it and come to terms with it. I find it useful to create a gaps table, whether it's a theory paper or an empirical paper, to have a table that says, look, here's the concepts I'm working with as the base. Here's what they tell us so far as a second column. And then there's a third column saying, you know, in this paper, here's the research questions that are going to help address the gaps that we saw in those concepts. And I now do those pretty much every paper, whether it's a hypothesis-based paper or a research-based paper. It helps me understand what it is I'm doing. And then, you know, you get to the end of the paper, and the question is, what do we get from it? And this is the discussion section. Does anybody else write discussion sections sort of at the end, and you're really tired and you just kind of throw some stuff in and hope that somehow magically somebody will figure it out, and maybe the reviewers will help you figure out what it means? Does that sound familiar to anybody else besides me? Because you're just so damn tired of the pieces, and you've lost sight of the forest, and you've been working so hard on the trees that you can't get back to the forest. This is the time to step back to the forest. And I think there's at least two, for a question-based paper, there's at least two ways of approaching the discussion section. One is just work really hard to say, here's the empirical implications, right? Remember the audience that we set up in the first paragraph. What do you now know that you didn't know when you started the paper? And why does it matter? In the context of the discussion that's going on in this audience, and really push ourselves to be really clear and precise about what that is. And then go back to the last paragraph in the introduction and make sure that what we say in the last paragraph in the introduction, which is the contributions paragraph, maps onto what we've said in the discussion section. And have a nice, tight, short contributions paragraph in the introduction that just summarizes, ideally in 1 or 2 sentences, and then build those points in the discussion. Or the discussion section can be for propositions. You know, we think we've got enough clarity in our logic. We didn't have it coming in. We have it now. Now that we've done the analysis, we've got it coming out. So let's set up some propositions for future research, or at least for future understanding of research. I'll stop there. I'm curious to see what my colleagues have to say, and I'll stop saying stuff. As Tim says, more research is needed. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Those were my conclusions, Will. So I guess I'm next. Thanks to Evan. Thank you, Will, for the words of wisdom. I think your wise decision not to use slides will soon be revealed as I try to share mine. And thanks to all 91 of you. I'm always amazed. One of the things that the Zoom world has brought us is kind of the ability to reach these large audiences that weren't there, or that were latent. Are my slides visible?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So this was something I pulled from the description of this panel. I think Evan wrote it. You know, sort of he set this up as a discussion on question-driven research and kind of framed it relative to more traditional deductive approaches of developing and testing hypotheses. And I want to note right at the start that this is just clearly wrong. It's a totally faulty premise. So, you know, kind of there's no way that what we're doing is hypothetico-deductive, right? You know, kind of if you read Karl Popper closely, you know, he's the person most closely associated with that approach. The things we do to rescue our theories in the face of contradictory evidence are what he would call ad hoc moves, and he just decries them completely. All of us, myself included, constantly peek at the data before writing down things that we may or may not call hypotheses. The idea that the hypotheses themselves are falsifiable is laughable. Just to give you one example, I'm constantly using kind of the fiction of rational, expected utility maximizing, profit maximizing firms, even though there's mountains of evidence contrary. Right? That doesn't mean that models and theories aren't useful. I completely agree with Will's point that having theories around to help structure our analysis is really important and valuable. But there is a practical problem that emerges from this view that we're doing something hypothetico-deductive like, and that the practical problem is that our papers and our talks, you know, sort of what you might broadly think of as our testimony, are structured as if we did that, okay? So there tends to be like a section at the beginning of a paper with, you know, where we say we're making some assumptions and we try to have some kind of deductive logic that leads to things we call hypotheses. Then maybe typically there's like frequentist statistical analysis, and, you know, sort of all of this builds to some kind of inference about what's the true data generating process, or maybe, you know, sort of people say they're even going to like, you know, reject or accept a particular theory. Okay. And so in thinking about the problem that emerges when we structure our testimony that way, Andy King, Brent Goldfarb, and myself, you know, sort of went to the literature on the philosophy of testimony and tried to sort of take a fresh look at this problem of like, you know, what could happen, what could go wrong if we're testifying that way. And so we have a paper that's forthcoming in AMR that does a few things. And one of the things it does is tries to develop kind of a typology for the sorts of claims or the sorts of inferences that authors in strategy and management research more broadly tend to advance in their papers. So we read a lot of papers and we came up with our own ad hoc typology that consists of 3 kinds of claims. One's an explanation. Explanations are claims like, here's a pattern I observe in the data. One reason I observe this could be the following, okay? A second extremely common type of claim is what we call a frequency claim. It's the kind of claim that is grounded in sort of frequentist statistical analysis, right? All the parts of the paper where people are saying, this parameter that I've estimated is significant at this level. There's an entire intellectual apparatus behind this, which is frequentist statistics. You're making claims about the likelihood of observing the data that you do see in repeated random samples from a population under an assumed model. A third kind of claim is a belief claim. A belief claim is a claim along the lines of, given our analysis, you should believe the following explanation is what's generating the data. And note here that we've flipped sort of where frequency claims are claims about the probability of observing the data or the probability of the evidence conditional on some maintained assumption, conditional on the hypothesis. Belief claims flip it around. They're claims about the subjective probability of the hypothesis being true conditional on the evidence. Okay, so maybe you buy this, maybe you think it needs some more kinds of claims, but we find this a useful typology of claims. What's the problem of testimony, if you think these are the kinds of claims we're making? The problem of testimony in the philosophy literature is the problem of, well, when do researchers, when do they have what they call a warrant to make these kind of claims? In English, when should we believe these kinds of claims? And in sort of reviewing the literature and thinking about this problem, we kind of came up with two really, I think, widespread problems with the practice of presenting our research as if it were hypothetico-deductive. And they apply to two different kinds of claims. One is, a problem that applies to frequency claims. In general, authors don't pre-specify their hypotheses and analysis plan, or if they do, they don't credibly signal that they've done it. And we can think of this as kind of the foundational problem behind a whole bunch of stuff that has been, receiving a lot of attention in the literature on, sort of the problem of credibility in empirical research. People note that there's phishing and p-hacking or hypothesizing after results are known, right? There's a lot of kind of bad practices, people casting aspersion on this stuff. I'm not convinced that this stuff is always as awful as it's made out to be, but it's clearly a practice that takes place that would undermine our ability to make warranted frequency claims. And people are either unaware of it or don't talk about it. A second and distinct kind of a problem applies to belief claims. With belief claims, the typical problem is that researchers fail to consider alternative explanations, or maybe as Will said, they just drive nails into the feet of the horse they're purportedly racing against with their preferred explanation. But sort of this is the problem that's often called identification, right? There are many hypotheses, there are many processes that might generate a particular pattern in the data, and we infer the truth of one because it's the one that we used to generate a hypothesis without sort of providing sufficient conditions to rule out others. So what could we do about these kinds of problems? In our paper, we describe two kinds of solutions. The first is really simple, and I think maybe closest in spirit to, or I mean, at least the most related to this idea of question-driven research. We could do what's called what we call honest abduction, which is to say, focus on presenting the facts and characterizing our claims as explanations. That's it. It's very simple. Explanations are warranted. You can, sort of say, you can offer explanations that you like for facts. You can even, kind of in the philosophy of abduction, you can propose criteria for what would be the best explanation. That tends to be controversial. But nevertheless, you can honestly abduct. The other thing that we propose in our paper is somewhat more novel. It's called specification mapping, or at least we call it specification mapping. Other people call it, sort of mapping the multiverse, or I think there's a variety of terms that have been proposed. But basically what we mean is something like carefully structured robustness testing on steroids. And we think that the benefit of this is it lets readers choose the analysis plan, right? You know, sort of the author doesn't have to pre-specify necessarily every step they would take in measurement, design, choosing a functional form, et cetera, before they run a regression. They can simply present all that and let the readers choose what they think would be the most credible set of pre-specified assumption and draw the inference themselves. So to give you an example of this, and then I'll stop, Durloff, Navarro, and Rivers took on the question of what's the effect of guns on crime. Prior to their work, this had been a super controversial question with people on both sides of the debate making claims and doing what we typically do, which is sort of finding analysis that supports their preferred conclusion and then defending all of the assumptions to the hilt, like really digging in behind their assumptions. What Durloff, Navarro, and Rivers did instead was they said, well, here's all the dimensions of choice that you have in the analysis plan. You know, how are you going to do your measurement? What covariates are you going to control for? How are you going to deal with time? You know, parameter heterogeneity, fixed effects or no? Should I use an instrumental variable or no? Okay. After they wrote down all of the different plausible ways to specify their empirical model, they had 865 different models, and they just ran them all and presented graphical distributions of the marginal effects so that the effects are all comparable, and showed that basically you could support any conclusion you want within that space of modeling assumptions. And as a final observation, you know, we think this is a really useful direction to go in a world where data and computational power is becoming very cheap. Because I think we want to move from thinking about sampling uncertainty, right, which is the underlying basis for all of the hypothesis tests we run, which doesn't make any sense when we're dealing with populations, to thinking about model uncertainty, which is the uncertainty around the validity of the assumptions that we're maintaining when we do the analysis, rather than some sort of uncertainty based on random sampling from a population. I'll stop there and look forward to the rest of the comments.
Excellent. Thank you, Tim. You know, looking at that graph, I have to say, like, what's the truth? You know, what is the truth? Where do we end up? Anyways, we can.
In that question, the truth is we don't know.
Yeah, that sounds honest. Excellent. Thank you so much, Tim. If you haven't checked out Tim and Andy and Brent's AMR piece, it's an excellent read. Okay, and let's move to Giada.
Yes, so here I am. Let's load this up. Okay, so good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot to Evan for putting this together. And actually, I'm also going to start by making a remark on the famous email that Evan sent us yesterday while trying to coordinate us on what we were going to talk about today. So according to his email, my assignment for today would have been that to highlight the practical challenges and elements that come into play when writing these sorts of manuscripts. And this is the part where I would like to draw your attention. What are these sorts of manuscripts that I write? So I sat down yesterday night trying to think about what characterizing these sorts of manuscripts. And so first, I mean, as a testimony to the title of the panel, I think I do research that is question-driven. In particular, I do it in a way that it's what Will has characterized as question-driven from the phenomenon side, because I can proudly say now I'm a phenomenon person, a definition with which I struggled a lot in my early years. So when I was on the market in particular, because people were looking for the theoretical underpinnings behind my work, and they kept on going back to the phenomenon. So that was something that I learned to do better over the years, but it was clearly an obstacle at the beginning. Second, I do research that is mixed methods. And here my mantra is no method is perfect. So if you have ever seen me present every paper, I usually say this at some point in time, because I firmly believe in the fact that no method is perfect, which basically is, I think, kind of liberating, because it's a way to be inclusive in the field and to think that if no method is perfect, then all methods have something to bring to the table. So we can actually leverage on complementarities. And finally, in the wild, which basically means that I try to do my research with real industry players in the industry. So even if it's an experiment, it's going to be in the field rather than the lab. And here I would like to refer to this false dichotomy between rigor and relevance. So clearly I do research in the wild, which basically means that by definition it's going to be messier compared to the sterile environment that you have in the lab. And I'm used to have these infinite conversations with my friends and colleagues who do lab experiments, who would tell me, yes, but you cannot control for this and you cannot control for that. As if the only thing I was worried about was external validity. But I think, again, this is a false dichotomy, because you can do research in the field and still be very rigorous about it. I was just attending a very interesting workshop on field experiments, so I think there's something definitely there. Okay, so given that this was my assignment, and now that we have decided what this definition is about, I decided to come up with with a list of 3 challenges that I think are common to people who do research of this type. So the first one is time. Doing this type of research requires you to spend endless hours, days, years, going to the field, developing an understanding of what is going on, trying to triangulate that with theory, then maybe formulate hypotheses, then design an experiment to test it, because usually this is what I do in the mixed method paper. And then given that field is not enough, I also try to replicate it in the lab. This all brings us down to what I would call the revenant syndrome, in which basically by the time you reach the moment in which the paper is written, years have passed. Let me give you an example. So in my recent work with my colleague, Maria Rita Micheli from IESEG, we took on this challenge of examining the behavior of physicists at CERN. And we started with interviews. We interviewed more than 50 of them. And then we decided a vignette study involving 500 physicists. And then we thought, well, maybe this is not enough. So let's actually go and do a lab experiment too, so that we can gather additional evidence on the mechanism. The result is that this paper, we started to work on it in January 2016. We are now in October 2020, and the paper is in the review process. So as you can imagine, throughout the process, I was nervous about the paper, clearly, but I was particularly nervous. And so I would like to somehow point on this about Maria Rita, because, you know, by the time I was working on this, I was already tenured, which clearly 1 year more, 1 year less for me maybe didn't make this huge of a difference. But if you are working with people who are more junior in the field, a year difference may make all the difference in the world. So I think what we can, what I would like to point out here as our responsibility as scholars who are aware that this research is out there, is that to create a safe space for juniors who want to do this type of work, which is particularly crucial given the fact that this is work that takes a lot of time. A second challenge is related to reaching empirical saturation, or when do you stop? I'm going to call this the Sagrada Familia syndrome, which basically means that you start working on a paper, and given that you now have this mix of methods that you can leverage on, and these wonderful complementarities, and you can also add this, and you can also add that, you end up trying to create these papers in which it's like you always want to get that additional layer of data, that additional potential method in order to understand better what you're dealing with. The risk is, of course, is that you will never stop. So here another example, my work with Elena Novelli and Martin Etou, who I saw in the audience, where we basically started by saying, okay, so we have this observational evidence on 5,000 individuals who are entering a recruitment program, and let's analyze those. And then we said, oh, maybe, you know, it's not enough. Maybe we can run a field experiment in the firm. And then we thought, well, we want to also run a survey, because this allows us to better understand the mechanisms behind what we're seeing in the data. And then once we try to guess, or we have a plausible explanation, I'm very worried now of the terminology given what Tim just said, but like, now that we have this explanation of what is going on, let's actually try and put this to a test by running an experiment. As you can see, this risks getting out of hands very, very easily. And I think probably the problem here is that I partner with Elena, who does secondary data and is used to a certain type of approach. I do primary data, so I'm not happy with proxies. I want to see things directly. I want to generate my data, look at directly the measures I'm interested in. The result is this endeavor that lasts for years once again. So time again is an issue. Now, this is related also to another point, which I think is to some extent the flip side of this phenomenon from the reviewer perspective. And that would be, what is fair to ask when you are a reviewer on a paper? So imagine you got this paper to review, and in this paper there was only the analysis of the secondary data, with us coming up with maybe hypotheses at the beginning and then testing the hypothesis with this secondary data. Would it be fair to ask to the authors of a paper like this to actually go and run an experiment in order to test the mechanisms that they're putting forward when formulating their hypothesis? I think no, to be honest, because you are asking authors to go into a completely different domain and leverage on complementarities that are there, but not necessarily using tools from a toolbox that they actually know how to use. Would I ask something like this to authors? No, but then again, what's the boundary? Where do we draw the line of what is actually we need to ask in order to make sure that we believe in the paper, in the testimony, versus what it's not fair to ask because it's just outside of the scope. So I think the responsibility here that we have as a community is that to educate the field. So I really applaud the effort of a paper like the one that Tim was talking about with Andy, Brent, and him, trying to really give us a sense of what we can do if, for instance, we are running this analysis using secondary data. And so, for instance, the epistemic map or the tables that the team was showing before. Maybe this is fair. I mean, you can ask this to someone who has written a type of paper. Another thing that you can do, and I'm going to use Evan now, giving the positive spin to the beginning, is that, I mean, is the master of this, right? Trying to maybe ask to visualize the data and allow to inspect what is going on in your data, and maybe that's the way to go. I don't know. But what I want to point out is that we need to be aware of the fact that there are complementarities and that you can always add an additional piece, but you also need to be fair when we ask people to ask these pieces to their own papers. And finally, the third challenge is related to positioning. I'm going to call this the weird animal syndrome. I've been affected by this syndrome. I mean, I'm affected by this syndrome, meaning that people look at me and they don't make sense of what I do. Are you a strategy scholar? Are you an OT scholar? Are you an OB scholar? The problem, I think, here is the fact that if you're interested in questions usually don't come with the label, I'm a strategy question. I mean, you just fall in love with them. So sometimes in falling in love, you may realize that you are going in directions that you were not expecting in the end. I mean, in the end, what you want to find is the answer to the question. So if this investigation brings you towards different paths, you need to be open to somehow embrace that. The example here is this work that I'm doing now with Cedric Gutierrez and Torsten Grosjean in my department at Bocconi, where we started by saying, oh, what explains the performance of teams? And then we started to realize that there were things related to the dynamics of teamwork that really made a difference. So we started with an experiment, but then we thought, oh, we actually can look at how people behaved during the experiment. And then we can analyze the text of what they were saying while they were walking the experiment. And very easily, you see, I'm shifting towards something that has to do with group dynamics, which may be a little bit more of a tough sell on a strategy journal. So our responsibility here, I think, is that to be inclusive, to be omnivorous, if you want, in terms of the research that we consume. And as reviewers, respect the differences. Differences in level of analysis. I mean, and this I take it for granted that we can do strategy research even if it's an individual level. I don't think everyone does, but I would do it. The mix of methods. There is this myth that a mixed method paper will give you an R&R, but in the process of reviewing the paper, you will lose one of the methods. So I hope we can change this. And then actually, I'm going to cite Will, and I'm happy that he actually said this again today. When I was a PhD student, he gave me this advice. He was reading one of my papers and he said, well, don't ask yourself whether this is strategy or whatever. Tell me, who's your audience? What is the conversation that you're joining? And I think this is actually the best way to think about it. So this advice stuck with me over the years. So concluding remarks, in the interest of time, so I would not want it in any other way. I mean, I painted this picture, which is kind of dark and gloomy, of all these difficulties and how tough it is to do this type of research. But to be honest, this is the only way in which I can think of myself as a researcher. So I'm happy that this is the type of work that I can do, that I have the privilege of being able to do. This doesn't mean there are no challenges, and I try to highlight some of them, which I also think gives us the perfect lead into the next talk, because I would really like to hear from Rajshree what's the perspective of someone who can change the system from the inside in trying to tell us how we can overcome some of these challenges. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Giada. I love all those wonderful pictures and examples, and best of luck with your paper that now you started 4 years ago. It's a long process. So with that, that brings us to Rashi Agarwal, and Giada set that up so nicely. So Rajshree, take it away.
Thank you, Evan, and great set of panelists. It's often bad to go last because everything that has been said has in some ways been said. And I think you'll also see through my slides some of the consistent messages that are coming across based on, oops, sorry, this is really the last slide. So it should have been the first one. Excuse me, this is where the technology is sometimes not very helpful to get done. So 1 second. So I'm going to be talking about all three aspects, practical, theoretical, and then spend some time talking, as Giada said, also about the editorial perspective as the co-editor-in-chief of SMJ, and really appreciate Will Mitchell's and other scholars who have laid the groundwork on setting up the question-driven research. Like Giada, I personally find myself very much a phenomena-driven scholar. And that's where I want to begin with my own intellectual journey, where I'm acknowledging the depth of the legacy of Michael Gort and Stephen Klepper, where it was always deep dive into a phenomena of interest which motivates theory development. Like Giada was talking about, this requires you to often do painstaking data collection, often compiled from various sources, and an intellectual curiosity that has to span industry contexts and levels of analysis. And I remember very early in my PhD when Michael talked about the dominant model in economics, which was this notion that he almost scoffed at as theorists, the assumption being that you sit in your ivory tower, you make up your mathematical models, and then testing empirical data, that's super easy. You just go out there, you buy a canned data set, and then you test your model, and voila, all of your hypotheses are supported. And he said that in the context, even way back in the 1990s, that that's not the way good empirical research is done. And indeed, if you think about that model, which is in fact almost a straw man, by the way, highly recommend this YouTube video, which is based on the philosophy of science. You know, it's basically, as we've already talked about it, following the deduction proposal. Heckman and Singer wrote a very nice article in the AER where they talk about what Tim has already talked about, this dominant classical frequentist statistics model. And notice that in this model, as he says, peeking at the data and formulating and building new models in light of those views, that's sin. And of course, one of the examples that he talks about of this dogma is that this requires investigators to specify all of their models in advance to looking at the data. But as Will has already talked about, this is just one way of doing science. And indeed, the other ways which are based, this question-based research is drawing our attention to, is all along we've talked about not just deduction, but also induction and abduction. And so question-based research is really about taking this induction and abduction much, much more seriously. In our world, we tend to use induction for grounded theory building, and we've almost equated induction to qualitative research. But indeed, you can do a lot of induction even from good quantitative research. And at the end of the day, what matters in this graph is that, as Giada was saying, you can do all of it like she's doing, very ambitious, But perhaps the best way for us to advance science is to not insist that every one of our papers do all three, and that single papers can take one piece of the puzzle and then go along and contribute to science in that manner. So what are some practical perspectives on taking on a question-based approach? And I'm going to use some of the examples of how I've done this research to kind of exemplify these perspectives. So when to use question-driven approach, and by the way, I have done the hypothesis testing, causal experimentation, causal testing. I'm not, as many of us on the panel will always say to you, that's not to say that hypothesis testing is not valid. But here the focus is going to be on these alternative types, right? So when do you use it? As Will said, first, when there are lots of alternatives. The second is if there are surprises, or the third is if you're going into unknown territory. So an example of lots of alternatives is the classic Gordon-Klepp paper, which really is a horse race across 4 different theories that they look at, and then they bring the data to bear across 45 different innovations. An example of surprises is the one that I recently did with Sergey Brzezinski and Atsushi Oyama, where we saw that even as the number of firms and output concentration was decreasing, there are 5 firms that emerged to become center of gravity. And then, of course, the puzzle was, well, why is this the case, and what are the underlying factors? A third example could be completely unknown territory. The classic Gordon-Klepper and industry evolution model looked at time 0 being first time of commercialization. And in Moin and Agarwal, we were able to look at this incubation period that people had not necessarily paid attention to prior to it. So these are some examples where you will see that it's basically a questions-driven or an abductive approach that is being created. Now, one thing that I do want to underscore as a practical one, and this is something that came across both in Tim's and Giada's presentations too. Rigorous question-driven research design is very critical. And this doesn't mean anything goes, right? You have to think very, very carefully about the fit of the question to the empirical context. More importantly, as Tim was pointing out, you need to be thinking about the empirical contrast, the model specifications, and how does that fit? And if you're performing an abductive example, you need to pay real careful attention to alternative explanations, right? And so question-driven research can provide a lot of value because it's the Sherlock Holmes style of what is improbable. And as a result, so going back to a question that was put in there, does this mean that all research, you can never know the truth? No, there are some things that are much, much more important and much more credible than others. So you can rule out implausible explanations as well. Now, in terms of how does questions-based research relate to theory? 2 stories here, by the way, to share. When I first moved from economics into strategy, I still remember I was on a committee of one of the students, and this student had about 35 hypotheses in his dissertation. And to kindly signal to him that perhaps he was in fact being theoretical and not necessarily paying attention to it, I gently said, well, you have way too many hypotheses. To which my colleague, who was the advisor, came down to me and said, Rajshree, what do you mean too many hypotheses? How can you say that? In fact, how is this contributing to theory otherwise? And I looked at him and I said, my entire dissertation had 0 hypotheses. Right? But that does not mean that it has to be theoretical. And there are some journal editors that do have the perspective that if you haven't written out a hypothesis, you're not contributing theory. And in fact, there are alternative ways in which question-driven research can contribute to theory. One, of course, is, as we've already talked about, the alternative theories. And now you're going to point out to improbability of alternative explanations through abductions. And then, of course, as Will was talking about, the way to develop theory is to bring theory development into the discussion. Buki, a lot of the examples that I'm talking about and the panelists are talking about are examples of good abductive papers. And we can share with you later on too some of the things that come up. So an example of new theory that was developed is the industry evolution theory by Gordon Klepper, where using these alternative theories and then taking the data of 45 innovations, they were able to discuss the dynamics of industry evolution in a very, very rigorous manner. Alternatively, in Moin and Agarwal piece, we don't have theory up front, but we do use the stylized finding and put it in contrast to received wisdom, compare the stylized findings with received wisdom, and talk about some novel theoretical implications that come up when you're looking at surprising or unknown territory questions. And so you'll notice that this table 4 is coming to the end. So the theory development is at the end of the paper rather than at the beginning of the paper. Now, Giada, you said as the editor-in-chief, what can I say as SMJ that's really trying to lead on this approach of question-driven thing? Even as an organization science senior editor, I've been encouraging authors to take on more question-based approach, particularly when I observed, as Bill Mitchell said, where the theory itself seems to be loose, there are alternative theories, it's not logical, tight aspects. One of the things that I will say, it's hard. And it's hard because we are so used to that deduction model framing. We are so used to thinking, and in fact, more than used to thinking about that way, we take moral judgments, particularly to our junior scholars, about any alternatives to the deduction model is really not good science. So editors, reviewers, and authors, as a result of it, there's a real need for what Giada is saying as an education of what this is. So issue number 1 is when taste-based differences masquerade as rigor-based mandates. And this is where I'm going to take on the entire deductive approach. And as Heckman and Singer themselves talk about in AER, is this abductive approach challenges economists to step outside this framework of received notion that Michael Gord had warned me about, which leads to this identification problem requiring you to separate out model and hypothesis testing and really embrace the iterative dynamic process. Is what is the data trying to tell us? What is it that we should infer from the data and build good theory out of? Issue number 2, and this relates to Tim's presentation and the great work that he and Brent and Andy are doing. And this here is focusing much more on, this notion that authors seem to believe that they must identify interesting patterns of evidence, develop explanations for them, and test these explanations all in the same report, right? Giada, kudos to you for doing that. But one of the things that we need to do here is to not retrofit and continue to pay homage to only one of 3 equally legitimate scientific approaches. So at the end, what I would like to say is that if as authors, reviewers, and editors, we end up trying to give up these straitjackets, what we really have is freedom within a framework. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rajshree. That was excellent. And we have about 11 minutes for presentation, and so for discussion. So I think what I'll do is just synthesize some of the comments here and just throw them back at the panelists. And so I want to start with one that Giada raised, which echoes a comment that Nicholas made, and has been my experience as well, which is Giada mentioned that this has to be a safe space for junior researchers. And I want to be mindful that as a junior researcher myself, it feels risky to submit a question-driven paper for fear that the reviewers are going to reject it outright. I've had the experience of reviewers telling me that I need to take my results and then reconfigure my hypotheses around them. Nicholas shared a story in the chat about his experience with a specification map where he actually created all these different models, and then the reviewers told him to just pick one. And so, let me just throw this out to the panel. What can we do to ensure that this is a safe space for both junior and seniors to submit these sorts of papers to SMJ and other places?
I'll say really quickly. It goes back to your audience. Know your audience and be really clear when you cite who you cite, especially at the beginning of the paper, first couple of paragraphs, and cite people who are relevant to your work and who, based on their published work, are open-minded around question-based approaches. And where appropriate, in your submission letter to the journal, say, here's some people you might consider as reviewers. And the editors aren't going to be locked into them, and be clear that somebody you think is friendly won't necessarily be friendly. But especially where the way you frame the paper and set it up, rooted in people who do the type of research and use the type of methods that you want to have a conversation with.
Send your papers to SMJ. We already do a lot of question-based research presentations, publications. And I want to underscore what Will said, right? Editors do want to accept good papers. And it's completely appropriate for you to write to the editors in your cover letter to talk about the model as well as the philosophy of your question-based research. Now, by the way, one of the things to warn you against, and this was about, is the bar higher for question-based research. One of the things that we often see as editors is, and Will, you can talk a little bit about your question-based research special issue and all of the things that came across the transom on thinking or masquerading as questions-based research. Often, question-based research is not a just the facts paper only. It's not, as I said, a substitute for careful theorizing. So very often what happens is you write a question-based research paper thinking that, in fact, you can kind of skip through the hypothesis or the logical building and all of those. No, that is not a substitute for doing good research. And that's one of the things that I would definitely underscore. Make sure that you are at the highest research bar based on all of the panelists and what we're talking about, and then signal to the editors that that's the kind of paper and the kind of reviewers you're looking for would be ones that you're not only joining a theoretical conversation, but you're also adhering to a particular methodological philosophy.
And this may be paradoxical, but don't masquerade a hypothesis paper as a question-based paper. Some papers deserve merit to be hypothesis-based paper. There is relevant logic in in one or two theories and that will drive to hypothesis. If you can do that, great. It's a wonderful model.
May I, to respond directly to the question about juniors, I would say, for sure, pick your audience to the extent you can pick your audience. But let's be clear that we're being normative. There's 101 people on this call right now who can be more open to perspectives that are, kind of in line with what we've been talking about. I also just want to confess to being somewhat confused about what question-driven research means. To me, it seems like we're talking about at least two different, it seems like what we're talking about is something having to do with putting hypotheses at the beginning of the paper, which relates to this stuff that we've had to say about testimony and thinking that we're falsifying hypothesis derived from some theory. Let me throw out a different distinction that I find really useful, which is this one that Andrew Gelman and Guido Imbens put forward about the difference between forward and reverse causal questions. They talk about forward causal questions being about the effects of causes. Those are questions that can be answered by, say, a controlled randomized experiment. And reverse causal questions are questions like, why did this happen? It's causes of effects, which seems really closely related to what Will was saying at the beginning about, our ambiguous multi-causal types of questions and strategy. it's fine to answer this question. We should just be also clear that they're much, 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 much harder than forward causal questions, because there's all the, you have an effect, there's probably an infinity of different things that might have caused it. And, so often there's a paradigm where we iterate between those two kinds of questions and we don't have to do them in the same paper.
Evan, if I could also answer this safe space for junior scholars, I would say encourage your students when they're undertaking their PhDs to take that banked time of 2 to 3 years that they're spending and use that time to develop data sets, methods that would then allow them that luxury of time, right? So then in some ways, Giada, you're kind of using that banked time as a PhD student itself. And Giada, you're a perfect example. You've talked previously about how your advisors help, encouraged you to take on questions that you were passionate about and would take a longer time amount too. But that PhD bank time is very, very good to learn all of that time. And that gives you that safe space. But of course, you do need advisors that are willing to promote this high risk, high reward type of a portfolio too.
And you need also, I think, from the side of the institution where you work, seniors who are actually willing to do that, letter writers who are willing to signal this when they write a letter for you when you go up for tenure. People in general, a community that understands that we are not always not all the same, and we may have different preferences about the type of research that we do, and different research may take different times, and publishing a paper for someone who does this type of research may take more time than for someone who does a different type. And this doesn't mean that one is better than the other. It's just that there is a different incubation period, different needs that you have to satisfy. So in the end, I think it goes down to this idea of we really should start reading the papers to make decisions also about tenure, because the face value of just counting them is not enough. And this is really at the level of the institution where you work. I mean, we have these discussions all the time. We don't count, there's no number. So I'm hoping that this is going to become more and more relevant as we move forward.
We have only 2 minutes left, and I want to be cognizant of the time, but let me just throw out one additional question that was on my mind, which is that I think of research as falling into two streams: research that is trying to establish causal effects, and research that is more descriptive in that it's identifying causal correlations without exploiting any exogenous shocks or variation. And so my question for the panelists, and maybe we just have time for one of you to answer this, given that you have a certain type of paper, do you see that question-driven research is more oriented towards one style of research versus another? Basically, how do we take this identification kind of credibility revolution and intersect it with this move towards question-driven research?
So going back to what Will said, there are a certain class of questions where endogeneity is not the problem, it is the issue. And embracing endogeneity very, very seriously requires you to potentially take on a question-based approach or a mixed methods type of a model. So one of the things that I have become a huge fan of more recently, and this is a shout out to several people that are doing historical research or using qualitative, quantitative data to address it, that, it kind of turns it on its head, that you use the quantitative data to establish correlations. And then you use the qualitative data to unearth the potential mechanisms and pinpoint causal inferences. It's also very, very good for conducting process model type research, right? And so for me, those are the areas where I tend to gravitate more towards question-based research. And then the typical ones where I have a priori hypotheses, I have a priori conjectures and so on, and ones that I can design good experiments or use natural experiments, that's where I would use the deductive model.
Okay.
30 seconds I would add is if you've got a great identification strategy, a reliable instrument, or an unambiguous diff and diff, doesn't matter whether it's question-based or hypothesis-driven, use it. If you don't have a great identification strategy, don't use a mediocre identification strategy because it's going to cause more problems than it solves.
Excellent. Well, let's give our panelists a round of applause, you guys. Thank you to the participants who came and all the questions and interaction. And thank you again to Tim, Rajshree, Will, and Giada. We really appreciate all of your thoughtfulness, and thank you for taking the time. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, Evan, for organizing.
Thank you.
My pleasure.